Chairman Keane, Vice President Hamilton, distinguished members of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the U.S., thank you for inviting me and having this hearing. I'm going to summarize and just isolate several comments in my testimony. Obviously, the rest is available for scrutiny and for questions. I think it is very important at the outset of this hearing to never lose sight of the fact that the killers behind the murder of 3,000 Americans on September 11th were not generic terrorists without clear political and religious motives. The terrorists were not simply a band of fanatics who, as so many officials and pundits have repeatedly stated, had simply hijacked a religion because of a fear of engendering charges of racism by Muslim leaders, a charge that is routinely applied to anything critical of militant Islam. There has been an assiduous effort to avoid labeling the terrorists of 9/11 by some commentators for what they really were, militant Islamic terrorists. Their behavior was informed and guided by their misguided interpretation of Islam. Unfortunately, efforts to sanitize the discussion of Islamic terrorism has led to explanations that exonerate the masterminds and perpetrators of any responsibility for their actions. In fact, a special Hollywood broadcast after 9/11 noted that the attack of 9/11 was simply, quote, pure evil, had nothing to do with religion. In fact, the 9/11 attack had everything to do with religion. It had to do with the doctrinal interpretation of Islam by militants. At the outset, it is critical to point out that militant Islam does not equal Islam. Islam as a religion, like Christianity and Judaism, does not endorse violence. Islam is a vibrant religion that gives spiritual comfort and meaning to its vast numbers of practitioners. And there are, precious few as they exist, Islamic writers, intellectuals, and clerics who openly and unambiguously repudiate violent Islamic ideology. But for the peaceful majority of Muslims around the world, it is not the West that is avoiding these distinctions. It is the militants who are trying to erase these distinctions by claiming there is no such thing as, quote, Islamic extremism. They have tried to hide under the protection of the mainstream majority. Anti-American radicalism was pervasive in the Muslim world long before the events of September 11th, and not limited to bin Laden and al-Qaeda. One only read the translations of the Muslim media in many parts of the world, including the West, to see the resentment, hatred, and anger, even in countries that are strategic allies, in particular Saudi Arabia. Persistent denial that radical Muslims were responsible for September 11 attacks, with the belief that either Israel or the U.S. had secretly launched the attacks, is further evidence of this rampant radicalism. The extent of radicalism in the Muslim world has gone largely unrecognized, particularly before 9/11, because of premeditated deception, a cloak of religiosity, intimidation, the power of Saudi Arabia and other oil producers, and a tendency by many in the West to dismiss radical statements as nothing more than rhetorical posturing. In the last 2 years, there has been a genuine, although belated, recognition that the problem and threat posed by al-Qaeda is not limited to card-carrying members of this terrorist group. Although al-Qaeda carried out the horrific attack of 9/11, the larger problem the U.S. faces is the militant Islamic culture and mindset that gave birth to al-Qaeda. In this regard, al-Qaeda is actually shorthand for a much larger religious phenomenon, militant Islamic fundamentalism, that has spawned violence and terrorism against the U.S., the West, Islamic moderates, or other perceived enemies of Islam. Within the framework of militant Islamic fundamentalism, a culture of violent jihad has become a common denominator, sanctioning violence, terrorism against moderate and secular Muslims, Americans, Westerners, Christians, Jews, and other infidels. To be sure, the Muslim world is not the only religious umbrella under which religious-sanctioned terrorism has taken place. There have been Christian, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, and other terrorists, for example. But today, no other religious-inspired violence matches the scope and transnational breadth of militant Islamic fundamentalism. According to research we have conducted, Islamic terrorist attacks have now occurred and been planned and supported from more than 100 countries around the globe in the past 10 years. One of the basic problems when confronting radicalism in the Muslim world is the unwillingness by some Western academicians, editorialists, and leaders to recognize the pervasive institutionalized support for and dissemination of jihadist ideology. The undeniable fact is that Islamic militants dominate or exercise disproportionate influence over the religious, academic, and media institutions in the Muslim world, with the notable exception of several countries such as Turkey and Indonesia. Within the Muslim world, the religious hierarchy has been traditionally controlled by Islamic fundamentalists. The question that we now face, and that which will be the discussion today, is to what should the response be, what caused this radicalism, and how should we behave in the future? Let me just state this. I do not believe that the enmity, anger, and hatred developed among Islamic fundamentalists in the Islamic world is a result of U.S. policies. I believe it is the result of the U.S. existence. It is a rejection of American pluralism, American secularism. Let me read to you a quote by Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a militant Islamic leader that some journalists have defined and described as a, quote, moderate, including a recent story in the Washington Post. Mr. Qaradawi is a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood living in Qatar. Let me read to you a quote. Secularism may be accepted in a Christian society, but can never enjoy general acceptance in an Islamic society. Islam is a comprehensive system of worship and legislation. The acceptance of secularism means the abandonment of the Sharia, a denial of the divine guidance and the rejection of Allah's injunctions. For this reason, the call for secularism among Muslims is atheism and a rejection of Islam. This is the underlying guide and motif that has led to the development of Islamic militancy. If Israel were to disappear tomorrow, disappear and an Islamic State were to replace Israel from the river to the sea, the mantra of Hamas, there would still be the same amount, if not greater degree, of Islamic fundamentalism. The problem lies in a vast, pervasive system of Islamic radicalism, largely perpetrated and sponsored by the Saudi Arabian government. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we see the rise of fundamentalism around the world coinciding with the oil revolution in 1973-74. Petrodollars began to fuel this. In the last 25 years, major radical Islamic institutions, I described some of them in my testimony, the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, the Muslim World League, International Islamic Relief Organization, some of which are tied to 9/11, forensically and clinically. These groups have been responsible for fueling Islamic militancy around the world. It is the Al Jazeera and other media stations that have largely inflamed Arab views and Islamic views about the United States. I do not believe the United States is culpable or responsible for the rise of extremism. If we look at extremist movements, generally speaking, we in the West like to associate extremist movements with being only part of a minor view. We like to believe that they can be isolated. What we have in the Islamic world is a much more pervasive system of beliefs, unfortunately dictated and manipulated by a disproportionately radical control over the institutions of the media and of Islamic religious institutions. I do not agree with my colleague, Ms. Bronson here, that, for example, Israel was putting money into the groups that would eventually become Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Israel, for example, in the 1980s, was allowing Islamic institutions to develop in Gaza and the West Bank because that's what it tried to do in terms of allowing more freedom to local populations. Unfortunately, it was occurring at the same time the entire Islamic world was being radicalized, in part by Jihad in Afghanistan. As a result of which, when Hamas was created and Islamic Jihad was created, we also saw the creation of more than a dozen other radical Islamic groups in Algeria, Tunisia, and elsewhere. This whole rise of Islamic fundamentalist ideology is coterminous with a vicious type of belief system that views the West, the United States, and the enemies of Islam to be defeated, subjugated, or repressed. In the Islamic militant mindset, the world is divided between Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Harb is the house of war, where it's permissible to wage war against those institutions or countries that do not subscribe to the Sharia or are not under Islamic sovereignty. Dar al-Islam is the house or the abode of peace, where that's where Islamic sovereignty reigns, such as in Iran, as it used to in Afghanistan, as well as now in the Sudan. I do not believe we have silver bullets here. There are silver bullets when it comes to stopping terrorism. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that law enforcement needs effective tools, as they have been given under the Patriot Act, to fight terrorist groups, seize their assets, as they have done. The problem is militant Islamic clergy, not just in Saudi Arabia or Qatar or elsewhere, but also in the United States, have portrayed every single attack on terrorist groups, including the freezing of assets and the arrest of actual terrorists, as somehow an attack on Islam. It is these, quote, moderate Islamic clerics, and I say so-called because they pretend to be Islamic moderates to the West, but in fact they are not. I'll give you one very good example. The World Assembly of Muslim Youth, It's a Saudi-run foundation with offices in dozens of countries. It has openly supported Islamic terrorism. There are ties between WAMI and 9/11 hijackers. It is a group that has openly endorsed the notion that Jews must be killed. WAMI in 1995, after the Oklahoma City bombing, issued a statement and provided money to the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, together with other Islamic groups, in an effort to portray itself as being very sympathetic to American problems and trying to show that it was anti-terrorism. It is this very group that has consistently portrayed the United States, Jews, Christians, and other infidels as enemies who have to be defeated or killed. And there is no doubt, according to U.S. intelligence, that WAMI has been tied directly to terrorist attacks. The problem is WAMI and its external group publications tries to issue statements protecting its identity as a moderate group when in fact it is anything but. In the end, I believe we are left with one very resolute thing. We have to stay the course. We have to stand up for the American principles of pluralism, the notion of the right to disagreement, the notion of the United States is a menace to the Islamic militants, not because of U.S. policies, but because of the very principles underlying our creation.